She was 20 years old when the desert decided whether she would live or die, and for 2 days it seemed content to let the question hang unanswered. Her name had meant something once, in a freight office with her family's name painted gold across the window. But by the time the buzzards began circling low over the canyon floor, she was no one at all, just a girl in a torn dress, with blood dried black along her hairline, left broken among the rocks by the very man who had raised her since she was 7. Cassius Marsh, her late father's business partner and the only father she had known since, had looked down at her crumpled body after the wagon went over the rim, decided she would not survive to inherit what was rightfully hers, and ridden away without looking back. She lived. And when she finally stumbled into a forgotten crossroads town with $11 sewn into her hem and nothing else to her name, she spent 9 of those dollars on a ruined homestead nobody else wanted, 4 blackened walls, and a single stone hearth standing alone like a gravestone in the weeds. It was, by any sane measure, the most foolish purchase a penniless, half-dead girl could make. But sealed beneath that cold hearthstone was a secret that had been waiting 20 years to be found. One that would not only save her life a second time, but stitch back together a town that had been quietly, bitterly broken in 2 since before she was born. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you have ever felt like the world had written you off as worthless, tell us where you're watching from tonight, because this story was written for you. Adeline Coyle Marsh had been born in the spring of 1867 in a modest house at the edge of Cottonwood Bend, a shipping and freight town in the New Mexico Territory that existed mostly because 2 roads happened to cross there and someone had to sell the travelers coffee and rope. Her father, Thomas Marsh, ran a small freight line with 3 wagons and a reputation for honesty so old-fashioned it sometimes cost him money. And her mother, a quiet woman named Constance, had died of a fever when Adeline was 6, leaving behind only a cedar sewing box, a Bible with pressed wildflowers between its pages, and a daughter who would spend the rest of her life trying to be as steady as her mother had been. Thomas never remarried, but he did take on a partner 2 years after Constance's death, a smooth-talking, sharply dressed man named Cassius Marsh. No blood relation, despite the shared surname that history and coincidence had given them, who arrived in Cottonwood Bend with capital, confidence, and an unsettling gift for making people believe whatever he wished them to believe. Thomas, lonely and overworked, welcomed him as a business partner, and, in time, foolishly, as something like family. Cassius called Adeline niece in front of customers, and called her nothing at all when the door was closed. But the girl was too young and too starved for a parent's attention to notice the difference for years. What Thomas gave his daughter, in the absence of riches, was work, and what work gave her was worth. From the time she was old enough to hold a pencil steady, he taught her the freight ledgers, how every wagon load, every debt, every promise a man made with a handshake instead of paper eventually needed to be written down somewhere. Because memory was a river, and paper was the only bank strong enough to hold it. "A ledger doesn't lie, Addie," he used to tell her, tapping the worn leather cover of his account book with one blunt finger, "even when the men who fill it do." She learned to read a column of figures the way other girls learned to read faces, learned to notice when a number had been altered, when an entry had been rushed, when the ink of one line didn't quite match the ink of the line above it. She learned patience from her father's insistence that debts, like wounds, healed best when tended carefully and not ignored. And she learned dignity from watching him extend credit to widows and drought-struck ranchers who could not pay, because he believed, with the same plainness he believed the sun would rise, that a community was only as strong as its willingness to carry its weakest members through a hard season. It was this belief, more than any other inheritance, that shaped her. She grew into a young woman quick with numbers and quicker with her hands, capable of mending a harness, calming a spooked mule, or balancing a week's accounts before supper. And though Cottonwood Bend was not a place that celebrated clever women, there were those. Old Dr. Purnell, the widow Alsop who ran the boarding house, the blacksmith's wife who taught her to shoot a rifle straight, who saw in her the same quiet steel that had once lived in her mother, and who loved her for it. Cassius, for his part, grew wealthier and more visible in town affairs each year, serving on the founding committee that oversaw water rights and land claims, cultivating friendships with the Territorial Land Office, and a banker 2 towns over named Thaddeus Vane, a man whose smile never once reached his eyes. Thomas trusted Cassius with the freight line's growth. What he did not know, what no one but Cassius and Vane knew, was that the two of them had been quietly redrawing the boundaries of the valley for a decade, buying up water access and forging survey corrections that shifted disputed acreage originally promised to Cottonwood Bend's founding families, into their own names, one legal-looking document at a time. By the time Adeline turned 19, her father's health had begun to fail, worn down by years of long hauls and harder winters. And it was Cassius who suggested, gently and reasonably, that Thomas sign over controlling interest in the freight line to ensure it would be properly managed should anything happen to him. Thomas, trusting to the end, agreed, believing he was protecting his daughter's future. He died that winter of a fever not unlike the one that had taken his wife, and Adeline, not yet 20, found herself an orphan with a legal guardian who owned the business her father had built, and who had, from that day forward, absolutely no reason left to pretend affection for the niece he had never truly wanted. For a year Cassius kept her on as a bookkeeper in the very office her father had built, a humiliation she endured because she had nowhere else to go, and because some part of her still hoped that decency might reassert itself in him, the way it sometimes reasserts itself in weather after a long storm. Instead, decency in Cassius had never existed at all. Only its convincing imitation, and what finally ended the imitation was Adeline's own competence. Going through the freight line's older accounts one autumn evening, cross-referencing them against land office notices she had no real business reading, she noticed a discrepancy. A parcel of land along Marrow Creek that had been recorded, years earlier, as belonging jointly to 3 founding families of Cottonwood Bend, now quietly reassigned in the newer county records to a shell company she recognized, after some digging, as controlled by Thaddeus Vane. She said nothing to anyone. She simply began keeping her own small notebook, copying dates and figures into it in her careful hand, the same instinct her father had planted in her rising up unbidden. A ledger doesn't lie, even when the men who fill it do. But Cassius, watching her more closely than she realized, found that notebook hidden beneath her mattress one afternoon while she was at market, and understood immediately what it meant and what it threatened. He did not confront her. That was not his way. Instead, he arranged, with an ease that still turned her stomach to remember, for her to accompany a freight wagon on what he called routine business through Solitude Canyon, a twisting, sun-blistered gorge 2 days' ride from town that shortened the route to the county seat by half a day and was used when necessary by men who did not wish their business observed. He rode with her himself, along with a hired driver named Odom, whose loyalty, she would later understand, belonged entirely to whoever paid him last. Halfway through the canyon, on a stretch where the trail narrowed against a sheer red wall with a 100-foot drop on the other side, the wagon's rear wheel struck a stone that Odom, she was certain even then, had placed there deliberately. The wagon lurched, the terrified mules screamed and bolted, and Adeline was thrown clear of the wreck and down a rocky slope striking her head against a boulder hard enough that the world went black. When she came to, hours later, in the blue chill of a desert evening, Cassius and Odom were gone, along with the wagon, the mules, and every trace that she had ever existed at all. Later, in town, Cassius would tell a grieving story of a tragic accident, of a wagon lost entirely, of a beloved niece he could not bear to speak of. He never once sent anyone back to look for her body. But Adeline had not died, and something in her, perhaps her father's steadiness, perhaps her mother's quiet fire, perhaps simply the animal refusal of a young woman not yet 20 to accept an ending she had not chosen, kept her moving. She bound her own head wound with a strip torn from her petticoat, drank rainwater collected in the hollow of a rock, and walked, for the better part of 2 days, following the canyon's downhill slope toward whatever lay beyond it. Because a girl raised on freight routes knows that canyons, like rivers, eventually lead somewhere. What lay beyond it was a crossroads settlement called Pion Hollow, smaller and poorer than Cottonwood Bend, its main street lined with half-shuttered storefronts and a general air of a place that had once expected to become something, and had quietly given up on the idea. She arrived at dusk, filthy and half-starved, and the first kindness shown to her, a bowl of stew and a cot in the back room of a church, offered without question by a widowed pastor's wife named Sarah Bell, was the first kindness she had received from anyone in over a year, and it undid her more completely than the fall from the wagon had. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her dress, money her father had insisted she always carry hidden against emergency since she was 16, and it was, she understood clearly, the entirety of her fortune in the world. She could not go back to Cottonwood Bend. Cassius believed her dead, and a woman who returns from the dead to accuse a respected businessman of murder, with nothing but a hidden notebook and no body of evidence beyond her own testimony, was a woman who would very likely find herself declared unstable, or worse, quietly disappeared a second time and more thoroughly. She decided over that bowl of stew, a place to stand while she decided what to do next, and Pion Hollow, with its cheap abandoned lots and its incurious residents, seemed as good a place as any to disappear into for a season. It was Sarah Bell who mentioned, almost as an aside, that the old Coyle homestead at the edge of town had been sitting empty and untaxed for nearly 2 decades, ever since its last owner had vanished without explanation, and that the county would let it go for a song to anyone willing to take the debt of its back taxes off their books. The Coyle place, when Adeline walked out to see it the next morning, was hardly a place at all anymore. Fire had taken the roof and most of the walls sometime in the past, leaving only a low foundation of river stone half swallowed by sage and bunchgrass, and a single chimney and hearth standing improbably intact at the center of the ruin, blackened with old smoke, but solid, as if the fire that destroyed everything around it had shown that one structure some strange mercy. It was, the county clerk told her without much interest, hers for $9 even, back taxes included, and good luck to her. Everyone in town seemed to agree that only a fool or a desperate woman would want it, and Adeline, who was at that moment both, paid the $9 without hesitation, because something in the sight of that lone standing hearth, steady, square, unmoved by whatever catastrophe had taken the rest of the house, reminded her powerfully of her father, of ledgers that didn't lie, of the stubborn belief that some things could survive being left for dead. She moved into the ruin with the $2 she had left and began, in the way of someone who has been taught since childhood that idle hands invite despair, to clear it. She pulled charred timber from the foundation and stacked it for firewood, cut back the sage that had grown waist-high through the old floorboards, and spent whole days simply sitting near that hearth in the cooling evenings, feeling, for the first time since the canyon, something like safety. It was on the fourth evening, while scraping ash and old debris from the firebox to see if the hearth could still hold a flame, that her fingers found a seam in the stonework at the base that did not match the mortar pattern of the rest. A single flat hearthstone, larger than its neighbors, that shifted slightly when she pressed it, as though it had been set deliberately loose rather than mortared fast like the stones around it. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a fire iron and increasing disbelief, to lever the stone free, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle with age, but otherwise remarkably preserved from moisture and vermin both, she found a leather-bound ledger, and beside it, a small tin box containing a folded letter and a single brass key. Her hands, she would tell Sarah Bell later, shook so badly she nearly dropped the fire iron on the whole discovery. She sat back on her heels in the dust of that ruined house, 20 years old and utterly alone, and opened a book that had been waiting in darkness since before she was born. The ledger's first pages told her, in a hand grown shaky with age but still legible, that this had been the property of one Ezra Coyle, and that it recorded, beginning in the year 1858, the founding shares of land and water rights allotted to the 7 families who had first settled the valley, later split between Cottonwood Bend and Pine Hollow. Before the valley had been split at all, when it was still one community bound together by a single creek and a single fragile hope of survival in hard country. Adeline read late into that night, by the light of a tallow candle, and what emerged from those pages was a history far larger and stranger than she could have imagined. Ezra Coyle had been the valley's original surveyor and self-appointed clerk, a man trusted by all 7 founding families to record fairly what each had contributed: labor, oxen, seed, water access, and what each was therefore owed in land. His ledger was meticulous, cross-signed by witnesses, dated and countersigned in a way that made it, she understood with her father's training rising instinctively in her, an original legal instrument every bit as binding as any deed filed at the county seat, and in several critical places, more accurate than the deeds that had been filed. Because deeds could be quietly altered decades later by men with influence at the land office, while a ledger buried beneath a hearthstone could not. The folded letter inside the tin box, addressed to no one in particular, but clearly intended as an explanation for whoever eventually found it, was written by Ezra Coyle himself in the last months of his life, and it told the second half of the story. Sometime in the late 1860s, a dispute had arisen over water rights along Marrow Creek, the boundary line between what would become the 2 towns, and rather than resolve it fairly, certain interests, Coyle named no names outright, though Adeline would soon understand precisely whom he meant, had bribed a territorial surveyor to redraw the valley's boundaries in a way that favored some families at the ruinous expense of others, splitting the original 7 families into bitter factions that had, by the time of the letter's writing, stopped speaking to one another entirely, formed 2 separate townships out of pure spite and grief, and spent years contesting one another in courts too distant and too costly for poor settlers to properly use. Ezra Coyle, heartbroken at what his valley had become, and unable to prove the fraud without risking his own family's safety, had done the only thing left to a man of ledgers. He hid the true record, the original and uncorrupted account of who owned what and why, beneath his own hearth, and prayed that someday someone honest would find it and set things right. He had died, the letter's final lines suggested, believing he had failed. Adeline sat with that letter until the candle guttered out, and in the darkness that followed she felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with purpose. She was a stranger in Peon Hollow, with no name, no money, and no standing. But she was also, she now understood, the sole possessor of a document that could unravel 20 years of a stolen valley's quiet, bitter division. A division, she realized with a chill, that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the very fraud she had glimpsed in Cassius Marsh's freight ledgers before the canyon. The same pattern of forged surveys and shifted boundaries. The same name, Thaddeus Vane, appearing now in Ezra Coyle's decades-old letter as the young surveyor who had first falsified the valley's lines before ever rising to become the respectable banker 2 towns over. It was not a coincidence so much as a single rotten thread running unbroken through 20 years of 2 communities' grief. And Adeline Marsh, 20 years old, penniless, and presumed dead, was holding the only proof of it in her own 2 hands. She spent the following weeks moving with the same careful patience her father had taught her over a lifetime of ledgers, because she understood, better than most, that a discovery this large could not simply be announced from a rooftop. It had to be verified, cross-referenced, and presented in a way that could not be dismissed as the ravings of a stranger with no name. She rode, disguised in a borrowed bonnet and calling herself only Miss Coyle, to the county archive in the seat 2 days distant, and spent 3 days comparing the original ledger's boundary markers against the currently filed deeds, finding, exactly as she suspected, dozens of small but consistent alterations. A creek bend moved 40 feet here, a parcel corner shifted there, always in the direction of land eventually consolidated under Vane's shell companies, and, more recently, under Cassius Marsh's own freight and land holdings. She learned, through careful and quiet questions at the boarding house and the mercantile, which of the 7 founding families' descendants still lived scattered between Cottonwood Bend and Pion Hollow, and found that the old wound of the valley's splitting still ran raw in nearly every one of them. Cousins who did not speak. A church that had split into 2 congregations 40 years before over which town should host the founding memorial service. A graveyard literally divided by an old fence line nobody could quite remember the original reason for. It was Sarah Bell, in the end, who helped her understand what she was truly holding was not merely a legal case, but a wound that needed tending as much as proving. And it was Sarah who introduced her, carefully and in confidence, to old Judge Hollis Adair, a circuit judge nearing retirement who had presided over the valley's water disputes for 30 years and who had never once, in all that time, been satisfied that the truth of the original land grants had ever properly surfaced. Adair listened to Adeline's account with the stillness of a man who has waited a long time to hear something he suspected all along. And when she finally showed him the ledger and Ezra Coyle's letter, laying them on his desk with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the telling, he was quiet for a long while before he told her, gently, that what she carried was either the most important document in the valley's history, or the most dangerous thing a young woman with no name could possibly own, and that she must decide, before going one step further, which kind of courage she was prepared to spend. Word travels in small places the way water finds every crack in dry ground, and it was not long before Cassius Marsh, still believing his dead niece safely buried in his past, heard rumors from a supplier passing through Pion Hollow of a young bookkeeper stirring up questions about old land grants and a lost ledger. A young woman calling herself Miss Coyle who bore, the supplier mentioned almost in passing, a striking resemblance to a girl he'd once known in Cottonwood Bend. Cassius rode to Pion Hollow himself within the week, ostensibly on freight business, and the moment Adeline saw him step down from his horse outside the mercantile, elegant and unbothered as ever, the ground seemed to tilt beneath her exactly as it had in the canyon. He recognized her instantly despite the changed name and the 2 years that had aged her face into something harder and more certain than the girl he'd left for dead. and in the careful, terrible conversation that followed behind the mercantile's back wall, he did not bother denying what he had done. He simply offered her money, a great deal of it, to disappear again, properly, this time, and permanently, and to hand over whatever documents she had found before she made herself and her half-forgotten family name a public embarrassment to men of standing. She told him, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, that she had already made copies, that Judge Adair already held them, and that the only choice left to him was whether he faced what was coming as a man who confessed, or a man who was dragged. He did not take the offer gracefully. In the days that followed, Cassius and his ally Vane worked what influence they still held to discredit her, spreading word through both towns that the woman calling herself Miss Coyle was an impostor and a fraud chasing land that was not hers, hiring a lawyer to challenge the ledger's authenticity before Judge Adair's court, and, in the ugliest turn of all, quietly suggesting to certain townsfolk that a stranger who had shown up out of nowhere, claiming to have found buried treasure beneath an abandoned hearth, was, at best, a confidence woman, and at worst, someone who ought to be run out of the valley before she caused real trouble. For a tense fortnight it seemed entirely possible that the truth would simply be smothered under the comfortable weight of two towns' long habit of not looking too closely at their own history, that the families still bitter after 2 generations would rather keep their grudge than reopen a wound that implicated men currently sitting on the town council. Adeline, staying now openly at the Bell parsonage with Sarah's fierce protection, felt the old despair of the canyon rising in her once more. The sense of being a person the world had quietly decided did not need to be believed. What turned the tide in the end was the ledger itself, and the plain, undeniable honesty of Ezra Coyle's meticulous hand. Judge Adair, working with a surveyor he trusted absolutely, spent 3 weeks rewalking the original boundary markers described in the ledger against the physical landmarks still visible in the valley: an old cottonwood, a particular bend in Marrow Creek, a cairn of stones on a ridge that Ezra Coyle himself had built as a corner marker, and found that every single one matched the ledger's original figures and contradicted the currently filed deeds in precisely the pattern of theft the letter had described. He called a public hearing in the autumn of 1888 in the very church building that had split 40 years earlier, inviting descendants of all 7 founding families from both towns to hear the evidence read aloud, and it was Adeline herself, standing before a room of strangers and near strangers both, who read Ezra Coyle's final letter to its end. Her voice steady even as many in that room wept openly to hear, at last, the true and simple explanation for a grief they had carried without understanding for 2 generations. Vane's forged surveys were exposed beyond credible defense, his banking practices drawing the attention of territorial regulators within the month, and Cassius Marsh, faced with sworn testimony, a verified original ledger, and Adeline's own account of the canyon corroborated by the driver Odom, who broke under questioning and confessed everything rather than face a noose alone, found himself with no remaining ally, no remaining reputation, and, within the year, no remaining freedom, sentenced by a territorial court for attempted murder and land fraud both. The land itself, once the true boundaries were restored according to Ezra Coyle's original and honest accounting, returned not to any single owner, but to the descendants of all 7 founding families in the proportions their ancestors had actually earned, undoing 40 years of division in a single autumn afternoon of testimony and tears. Adeline Marsh, who might easily have claimed a fortune for herself as the finder of the ledger and the rightful heir to whatever remained of Ezra Coyle's own original share, asked instead only that the Coyle homestead's foundation and its single surviving hearth be preserved as common ground, a meeting place where the 2 long-divided congregations could hold, for the first time in 40 years. A single shared harvest service beneath the open sky, around the very hearthstone that had kept the truth safe until someone with nothing left to lose was foolish enough, or faithful enough, to go looking beneath it. It is worth remembering, now, that Adeline Marsh was 20 years old when a man she trusted left her for dead in a canyon, believing a penniless orphan girl posed no threat worth finishing properly, and that she was still only 20 when she spent 9 of her last $11 on a ruin nobody else wanted, because something in a lone-standing hearth spoke to the same stubborn faith her father had planted in her, that the truth, carefully kept, does not perish simply because the world stops looking for it. What she found beneath that hearthstone was never really treasure in the way the word usually promises. It was memory, honestly kept, waiting for a hand patient enough to lift the stone. And what she did with it once found was, perhaps, the truer inheritance her father had left her all along. Not wealth, but the unbending belief that a ledger and a life are worth keeping honestly, even when no one else is watching, because someday, someone will need exactly what you were careful enough to preserve. Thank you for spending this evening with Adeline Marsh and the valley she helped make whole again. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and they matter to us more than you know. Until next time, stay close.